I mean, I got to see Matt Smith's ass this episode, so 10 out of 10, no notes. Game of Thrones is back, baby. Jokes aside, hello everybody. Yes, I am here to review the very first series premiere episode of The House of the Dragon, the spin-off show, and the first of possibly very many spin-off shows of Game of Thrones. So I feel like this is going to be an interesting conversation because I feel like every single one of us, like literally every person on Earth, is coming into this show with some form of expectation or thoughts about it. Like, I generally try to come into a show with as blank a slate as possible, judge it on its own merits, but this one is very, very difficult given just what it's coming off of. One of the biggest shows of all time, and yet also the show that has probably the most vitriolic and just divisive. I don't even want to say divisive because I think we pretty much all agree that that final season of Game of Thrones was just out and out bad, just horrible. And I feel like for so many of us, it kind of sours the entirety of the original Game of Thrones series, right? Like, I loved that show so much, but it's hard for me to ever want to go back and rewatch it just knowing where it ends, even though I know for 6 seasons or so of that show, it's truly excellent. And then just flops on its face right at the finale, but it just sort of ruins the entire rest of the experience. But I also do have a lot of fond memories of that show, like waiting up and enjoying it with so many people and just waiting for every episode to come out week to week. Even when I was hating it, I was enjoying just discussing it. So coming into this show, I have so many mixed feelings because I kind of have that, like, yeah, I would like to go back into this universe and learn more, but I'm also just very soured on it. And especially, and this is something that I think I need to articulate before I even discuss the show itself, because I think it's just important to kind of know where I'm coming at this show with, is it's hard for me to really get excited about this story specifically because of all the Game of Thrones projects that I've heard about that might have come out after the show ended. This is the one I was least interested in because we had the one that got filmed but never got released because apparently it wasn't good or they didn't like it. But conceptually, they had that show where it was set like thousands of years before Game of Thrones. It was going to show us like the Age of Heroes and the beginning of the White Walkers and all that sort of stuff. And honestly, that was engaging to me. And then another show that they're still banding about and still might happen depending on if this show does well is the sort of Jon Snow sequel series, which also sounds interesting to me, not just because I love Kit Harington and would love to see him in more things, but also because it would, by necessity, have to be something different than what Game of Thrones was. Like, we don't have that same sort of setup and you would have to follow him beyond the wall and things like that. Like, it would just be a show that would still be in the same universe and yet would have to be different. Same with the Age of Heroes one. Yet, the House of the Dragon, and it's this thing that Hollywood just loves to do. I mean, look at Star Wars for like a perfect example of this, is that they want these franchises to just stay very static and just be the same things regurgitated over and over and over again. And this show is the one that they could make that would be closest to what Game of Thrones, the original series, was, because it's kind of set in the same vague-ish time period, set in the same locations, you know, the same houses. You can still do the backstabbing and conniving and all that stuff. And so it feels ultimately just like they're trying to redo Game of Thrones, but because we ultimately know where this all leads, and it's like a direct prequel, like right before, like very closely before what we see in Game of Thrones, I'm hesitant to see what it's going to be that can surprise us and can really do something unique. So really, it's coming into the show with all of that stuff. Like, I haven't even talked about the show yet, and I'm already coming into the show with just all of that baggage, and so it's really difficult for me to sort of look at it with that. Now, all that being said, I am going to try to look at the show with my own fresh pair of eyes and try and give it on its own terms. It's a fair shake, but it is going to have to sort of wrestle with all of those feelings because I think all of us are feeling that. That preamble out of the way, let's actually talk about this show, and I'll go through it with all the specifics and kind of the things that I found interesting and unique about it, but let me just sort of give overview thoughts. And I think my biggest overview thought that I can give is, it's fine. I wish I had like a stronger, more like bigger opinion, like it's awful or it's great, it's fantastic, a return to form. But like watching this premiere episode, which is all I've seen so far, it's fine. I did find myself liking being drawn back into Westeros. I loved seeing this world, and as much as I was soured on the end of Game of Thrones, it still felt nice to be like, yeah, I do remember this world and do enjoy it. And I do like the sort of politicking and fantasy world building that we get to see here, and it's just familiar in all of those senses. And then the characters that we get to meet throughout the episode, I feel like are interesting and intriguing, but none of them are like big characters that I found myself like really, really drawn to, like Eddard Stark in the first season of Game of Thrones, or even Robert Baratheon, who was sort of this big character in that first episode. But then again, if we go back and look at that first pilot episode of Game of Thrones, it was still also doing a lot of setting building as well, and a lot of the characters that we know and came to love that appear in that episode, we didn't get a lot of in that episode, but I still felt drawn to a few more of them than I think. I mean, even Dany and also Khal Drogo just had these presences that really no one in this series really feels for me, except for maybe Matt Smith. And it might even just be the fact that I like Matt Smith from his time on Doctor Who and some of the other projects that he's done, even though Hollywood has wasted Matt Smith so badly since he left Doctor Who. It's kind of disappointing because I love him so much. And it might just be on the back of my love for Matt Smith that I'm giving him a little bit more weight in this show, because other than that, he's really the only character that like deeply stands out for me. But there's no one here that like I was so out on that I was like, ugh, God, I'm so bored by them. I was like, okay, I'm here. But ultimately, for the most part, it just feels like kind of lukewarm Game of Thrones, at least at this point. But again, I'm willing to give it more time to grow on me, because it's a decent start, just not a like, oh my God, stellar one. But shows can grow over time, as Game of Thrones itself did. The one element, though, that I will say that I am intrigued by with this show, that I know that the writers of the show must have been drawing from this intentionally, but also it just seems like this show has also hit upon something that we're all kind of like talking about and wrestling with, and that is gender politics. Now, certainly gender politics existed in the original Game of Thrones series, very much so, but this show seems to be really, really focused on it, and this sort of like dichotomy of like a woman's place and a man's place, and a woman entering a man's world, but also what does a woman want to do in this world, and sort of being able to try and do her own thing. We got a sort of like a proto Arya in the form of, I have to look at my phone because I forget people's names. Rhaenyra, I believe is her name, the sort of lead Targaryen girl, the sort of eldest daughter of Viserys here. Apologies if I say the name wrong. I'm still learning them. There's a lot. It's Game of Thrones. We all know this. But with her, we get sort of like a proto-Arya Stark character who she doesn't really want to be in this world at all. She wants to go off and do her own thing. But unlike Arya Stark, who, you know, doesn't necessarily have to have this expectation placed onto her at the beginning, here she's sort of in this weird between world where she wants to sort of have more access to be able to have agency to go out in the world to get to do what she wants to do, but also it has this lineage of being Targaryen as well, but also being a woman, so she has to sort of like be in a woman's place within that world too, and that I found to be very uniquely interesting as well, and as well as this whole idea about like heirs, and do women get to be heirs, do men get to be heirs, like all of that discussion I thought was very apt towards a lot of the places that we're talking about, like the control of women's bodies and control of women in especially in the United States today, but around the world, but most especially in the United States with things like Roe v. Wade and other issues that have come up around women's rights and women's access to bodily autonomy and things like that. And that even gets brought up even more explicitly here. We have this story of Viserys' wife, and I just do enjoy those scenes where those sort of questions are brought up with Rhaenyra sort of going to her mom, and she said, oh, you know, our place is the women's bed. But then we get Rhaenyra with I forget the name of her, but the sort of other girl, the Hand of the King's daughter, who she's best friends with, which, by the way, I'm getting very much lesbian vibes from those two here. So I'm intrigued if that is the direction that they're going, because they don't overtly state it here, but Game of Thrones was... It was at an era where, like, it was a little bit shyer about LGBTQ things than we are today, but less so than shows of the time were about LGBTQ stuff, so I'm curious to see how they're going to handle queer storylines in this show, whether it will be just sort of coded or not. But yeah, I'm getting definitely, like, lesbian vibes from those two, and I'm curious to see how that's going to develop. But how she's situated with that. However, one element of this that I'm sort of wrestling with is the scene where we have the pregnancy, and we eventually learn that they need to perform a C-section on the on Viserys' wife in order to possibly save his child, who we ultimately do learn is a son, and he chooses to go forward with the C-section, and it's a very visceral scene. And on the one hand, I kind of enjoy this. Enjoy's the wrong word, but I like it as a choice, because it is about, like, this guy gets to choose his wife's bodily autonomy. He gets to choose for her around the autonomy of herself and her own body versus the child inside of her, which, again, very much fits into the Roe v. Wade discussions that we've been having in the United States nowadays. And so I think that this show is hitting on those themes, which are kind of apt, and sort of control of women's bodies and how horrific and gruesome it can be. But then also, for a show that like was talking about before coming out, it's like, we're not gonna have these gratuitous sex scenes, which there are some gratuitous sex scenes here. We get to see Matt Smith's ass in here, so I don't know how truthful they were about that. But that being said, there's also this sort of like, we get to see her getting cut open and her dying, which is really horrific to watch. Like, it was really, really rough. It was one of the roughest scenes in the episode for me. And not that I'm shy about watching that stuff, but I ultimately wonder if like it was too gratuitous for what if it was just like the show just trying to show that to just be like all like gross and nasty and just sort of like be attention grabbing in that way. But then again, it is hitting upon real themes. So I'm unsure how I feel about that scene in terms of how it was depicted, but the choice of what of the storyline I actually think is very good. Continuing on, though, with some other things that I found interesting. Again, Matt Smith is probably the standout performance here. And again, I might be grading him on a curve considering I like Matt Smith, but he is very interesting here. I think he might be a little bit miscast, but again, we'll kind of have to see. But I do enjoy what his character's presence means for the show, because he is very clearly like, he's supposed to be this police state guy, very like authoritarian, fascistic power, like, a tyrant, as they sort of say, and this kind of vague threat of like, if he gets control of the realm, he will be this really horrible person to take control. And you can definitely see that in a lot of the choices, like with the City Watch scene where he goes in and just, again, creates like a police state, I think is a really visceral scene that just sells well the threat of him. And yet, he does not feel like a broad strokes like caricature that he could have been. Like, it would have been very easy for this character to just be like, and I'm evil, like the Mad King sort of thing that we got alluded to in Game of Thrones. Like, they could have easily gone that route. Or a Viserys from the original series, that was Dany's brother from the first season of Game of Thrones, who gets like the gold poured on his head. I forget his name. That dude. It could have been very similar to that guy. And sort of just this guy who just hate and just despise. And yet, Matt Smith does bring a I don't know, a bit of humanity to him. Like, he's clearly a bad dude, and I don't like him. But there is an element where you like understand his emotions at times, and a bit of conflicted nature, like at the funeral. You can tell he's upset at the scene, and he's upset for his brother. He's not emotionless, like, yeah, my brother's son is dead, now I might be able to be the heir. Like, that's clearly, he sees it as a good thing, and he's clearly impulsive and angry that you see during the tournament. But he's not so broad strokes that he doesn't have a heart. And I find that to be an interesting character. I really think that whether it was written or Matt Smith brought in the performance, I think it makes for a more interesting character than he very easily could have been. So I think that he is very strong here. I also really like his scenes with Rhaenyra here, who is my second favorite character in this show so far, because you can see that they do have affection for each other, and in true Targaryen fashion may have more than simple familial affection for each other, though we don't know that yet, and also with Rhaenyra possibly having either bisexual or lesbian feelings for her Hand of the King's daughter friend, again, I forget her name. That creates an interesting dynamic, especially since the show is pitting these two against each other. So they do care about each other, maybe in some ways, maybe it's manipulation, maybe it's not, and maybe it's going to cause conflicted feelings when they do eventually butt heads. So I found that choice of those two characters' depictions to be kind of interesting. One other thing to mention is the tournament scenes were very interesting. Obviously, they're to set up some of the characterization of Daemon/Matt Smith's character, as well as give us an insight to some of the houses and people going ons at this era of the Westeros world. But also, I did like this idea that these people have never seen a real war, and so they're all like raging for a fight, and they may actually get a war in the very near future, given what we know this show is headed with the war between the Targaryen sides. So that was a nice little bit of setup. But moving beyond him, I do have to say, outside of the characters that I just sort of pointed at, I don't find myself drawn really to anybody else. I mean, we have this Hand of the King guy who's clearly trying to push for power a little bit, but not... He's kind of just there. I mean, everyone just... That's my feeling on everyone else so far. And again, it's just the pilot. We will get to see more of them as the show goes on. But everyone else besides Matt Smith and Rihanna, and also Viserys the King, it just feels sort of there. And I didn't get a really strong sense that they have these, like, personalities that I would be drawn to and intrigued by in the same way that I would be like Khal Drogo or Dany or Ned Stark, or even Rob or Jon or Bran or Arya. Like, all of those characters had like a really strong character. Sansa even though I didn't like her initially. But these characters, I'm just sort of like, yeah, they're there. They exist. I don't hate them. They're fine. The council is all fine. They're all fine. It's all just fine. And so everything outside of what I just mentioned, I just think is fine. I mean, I don't have any strong feeling one way or another. It's like more Game of Thrones. They're Game of Thrones kind of stock characters, and I don't feel strongly one way about or the other about them. And I really think that this show, if it really wants to capture that Game of Thrones magic, is going to really need to flesh them out, to really make me get into them a little bit more. And it also does have me wonder whether or not this show is going to be one that will build out in the way that Game of Thrones did. Like, Game of Thrones was a continent-spanning show, whereas this one feels very much honed in, I mean, it's in the title, on the Targaryens. And so I wonder if this show is ever going to feel like it's going to have the epic scope that Game of Thrones had, given that it's a much narrower focus. It could. We could see that expand out, as we clearly see vying for control of the kingdom that this show is sort of focusing on. So it could expand out that way, but as it stands now, I'm curious to see how that's going to build out. It's not a bad thing in this episode, but I'm curious to see if it's going to really hook me in that way. But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it being smaller will ultimately be to its benefit by giving it its own voice that is separate from the original series. So we'll see. We'll have to see. Some other small things that I'll mention. I do like some of the small bits of world building here. Like, we have the Triarchy from the Free Cities, which is interesting to see them sort of being in a different place than where they were at in the Game of Thrones era. And I also like just seeing small things like dragons being around and how much more they're normalized in this. Like, guards are much more okay with them being nearby, and are able to control the dragons and guide the dragons a little bit more, as opposed to like Game of Thrones time, where everyone was just sort of scared and there were these big creatures. I mean, they are big creatures here, but they are more normalized in the society, and I found that to be kind of intriguing as well. And then there's just like little small other elements of world building of how things are different and how things are very similar to the Game of Thrones era, and just the references to the different houses and things like that. And I'm sure we'll get to meet more of the houses and knights as the show goes on. Like, we get that one knight who is like this mysterious guy at the tournament, so it'll be curious to see what happens there with him. I'm sure he's a character in the book. I do remember there's like a Dunk and Egg character, like two characters in Game of Thrones books. I'm curious if they show up in the show. I think they do, or that might be that night. I don't remember, to be quite frank with you. I read them way back in college, so I vaguely remember what that story is about. I remember he was like a knight or whatever. And the only other thing that I'll end on is sort of a more like fine sort of note is the last bit where we have Viserys naming Rhaenyra, something like that, as his heir, and he sort of tells her like there's this prophecy that our ancient ancestor had. It was the White Walkers coming, like there was this thing, the winter that would come down from the north, very clearly alluding to the events of Game of Thrones, this sort of big off prophecy. And he even name drops it's a song of ice and fire, ooh, and we all are supposed to like, oh, it's the thing that we all know. And I'm just sort of like rolling my eyes like, sure, fine. Like, whatever. You have to have your prequel nonsense in here to really draw it into the original Game of Thrones. I'm sure that was some studio mandated nonsense to like really have that in there. Hopefully it doesn't really be a center focus for the show, because I would be kind of annoyed where it's like, yeah, the Targaryens need to be in control because of this Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, because we ultimately know where that's going to go. It's going to end with the Mad King and then Dany and all that jazz. So it's like, I really hope they don't hang their hat on that too strongly. Maybe it's just a minor motivation for our character to be like, we need a Targaryen in the seat, and that sort of like is this big sort of factor motivation for them. But ultimately it's not like the central focus, because otherwise I'd be like, oh my god, I don't really need this prophecy bullshit, because it ultimately just, we know how it goes, so it's not really interesting to me. But beyond that, that's my thoughts on House of Dragons. It's a fine start. I am not so out on it that I'm like, oh, this is dumb, but I'm not so excited about it. I'm like, yeah, Game of Thrones is back, baby. It's just more Game of Thrones, and I think time will tell if it's just a lukewarm Game of Thrones, or if this show can ultimately grab hold of its own identity in a way that makes it interesting in upon itself, rather than just a regurgitation of the show that came before it. And I think that is going to be its biggest battle, trying to differentiate itself in an intriguing way, rather than just sort of being the same thing, but mildly more lukewarm, because we know where it's going and we've seen it before. But that is all my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on House of the Dragons. Let me know in the comments below whether you liked this episode, whether you hated it, whether you think it's dumb, whether you were more excited for those other shows. I'd love to hear all of that down in the comments below. Beyond that, thank you so much, my friends. Mwah. Don't forget, Star Trek Lower Decks is also starting this week, so that review will be out Thursday. I'm so excited for Season 3 of Lower Decks. And we also have She-Hulk this week, and I'll also be reviewing The Rings of Power in a few weeks when that starts as well. So, all that stuff's coming up in the future. I will be reviewing every episode of The House of the Dragon, unless, like, nobody watches these reviews and the show just tanks and it's all horrible. But beyond that, that happening, I will probably be reviewing every episode of this show. So, we'll get into that in the near future. But beyond all that, mwah, thank you all, and I hope that you all live long and prosper.